Good afternoon and good evening to everyone joining us for this online distinguished lecture titled Gender Goes the World Go Round, Feminist Interventions on War and Peace in South Asia. So this lecture is being delivered by Dr. Shweta Singh, who's an assistant professor senior grade at the Department of International Relations, South Asian University, which is a university established by the SAARC nations. So first of all, thank you so much, Shweta, for joining us this evening to deliver this distinguished lecture, which is being co-organized by the UNESCO Peace Chair Department of Geopolitics and the Gandhian Center for Philosophical Arts and Sciences. So before I invite my student Teresa Shaju to introduce the speaker, let me first invite Professor Vardesh Hiragange, who's a director of GCPAS, to give the introductory remarks to the lecture.
Thank you, Dhanashri. In fact, I'm also eagerly waiting to listen to Dr. Shweta Singh. Also because women's voice is not much heard, or rather ignored, in matters of war and peace. War, in that sense, it affects everyone. It affects men, women, and all others in certain specific ways. Perhaps more men die, numerically, statistically. Also because in most of the cases, men initiate war, so they participate and they perpetuate. But perhaps women and children are the most hard hit. Men die, but women survive and face the trauma of war. They suffer, and they suffer the most, perhaps. Many times they are also the victims of the fallout of the war. So those who are studying geopolitics, international relations, and peace studies would know what could be the fallout of war, especially on women. Also due to the excesses of military operations. But perhaps if women were to be in the forefront, many of the wars perhaps couldn't have happened, could have been avoided. But gender studies is, of course, much more than this. Perhaps it has taken many decades for gender to become a serious area of inquiry. It has taken years and years, and also influence other areas of study. For a long time, in fact, our art, literature, philosophy, politics were primarily dominated by a notion which generally cultural theorists use, the notion which cultural theorists use. So something called as dwem. So you can try to decode this. Of course, certainly not having any racial connotation, pardon me. So this dwem primarily means dead white European males. Dwem, dead white European males. Our major areas of study all these years So be it literature, be it philosophy, be it politics, be it different forms of arts, primarily dominated by them, dead white European men. You can just make a list of philosophers whom we study, list of literary theories whom we study, list of political philosophers whom we generally study. Only of late we keep hearing about women theorists, women philosophers, women artists, women art philosophers, women literary theorists. So only of late we have started studying, and women dominated this area of inquiry for a long time. It's not primarily to portray gender as some kind of a anti-men inquiry. So primarily gender standing for equality of gender, not to getting into that fine distinction between sex and gender and all that. But even among all the liberal arts, humanities and social sciences, perhaps if there is one field that doesn't adequately represent gender, rather gender is to an extent least represented, correct me if I am wrong, that is, I think, this area of geopolitics, international relations, and even peace studies for that matter. So even though, of course, more and more young ladies are studying geopolitics, IR, and peace studies, of course, our own departments are a fine reflection of this kind of a changing trend. More and more young ladies are studying these areas which were primarily the domain of men for a long time. That's a healthy trend, in fact, because it can also redefine the very direction of geopolitics. It can redefine the direction of geopolitics. But certainly, gender perspective is something underrepresented in matters of war and peace. Certainly underrepresented. If you take any conventional IR text, so you find realism, idealism, pragmatism. So these are the predominant theories of IR. And in fact, gender perspective in that sense is a recent entry. You do find, of course, gender perspective in many of the recent texts on theories on international relations, even in peace studies for that matter. But so we need to integrate. We need to integrate this gender perspective into IR, peace studies, geopolitics, etc. This can make a difference. This gender perspective can make a difference. In fact, it can make the world turn around. It can bring down bloodshed. So we are also sitting almost in the middle of a war. So reports are pouring in. And in fact, in this context, I think I congratulate Dr. Shweta Singh and also Dr. Dhanashree Jairam, so who are trying to bring in this kind of a gender perspective in all these areas, be it geopolitics, be it IR, be it peace studies. So I'm so happy And I'm also equally eager to listen to you, Dr. Shweta Singh. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those introductory remarks. Now I would like to invite our postgraduate student, Teresa Shaju, for introducing our special guest. She is a postgraduate student at the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations. Teresa.
Hello. So Shweta Singh is a senior assistant professor of international relations at the South Asian University, New Delhi. She was recently appointed as the UN Women International Expert on Populism, Nationalism and Gender. She is also a co-editor of a Roman and Littlefield book series titled The Feminist Studies on Peace, Justice and Violence. Her recent publications include Towards an Intersectional Approach to Populism, Comparative Perspectives from Finland and India, then In Between the Almas and Local Warlords in Afghanistan, Critical Perspectives on the Everyday Norm Translation and the UNSCR 1325. And finally, the Gendering Education for Peace, a Critical Perspective. Over to you, Dr. Shweta.
Thank you so much, Teresa, and thank you very much, Professor. I have to say that Professor Varagange and Dhanashree, thank you for inviting me to this space. I think conversations like this are so important, and I have to admit that I'm very fascinated by the phenomenal programs that you have at your center, and it looks like a great opportunity, not just today, but I'm looking at this as a space for continuing conversations between our universities in that context. So thank you once again, Professor Hiragange and Dhanashree, and it's a pleasure to be amongst young students and research scholars. Now, where do I begin the story? I was thinking about it, and I've been thinking about this in times when we are all not very comfortable, and I thought, let's talk about how does this idea of gender makes the world go round? What are the questions that we can ask? And as I said, it's very interesting to talk about gender and international politics as we see deadly images of warfare coming out of Kyiv. In some instances, what disturbs me is a smirk so characteristic of Putin, and images of the Ukrainian president in the military uniform go viral. Why do we need to talk about all this as we think about gender and international politics today? Isn't it all very simplistic about women and women just being the victims of war and violence, and stop with it? Where am I beginning my story? Am I here to talk about women as victims? Where is my story on the international really begin with? So I think I would have no answers for you today, but maybe by the end of this 30 minutes, if we have more questions, I think my purpose would be solved. So what do I aim to do? I have a very limited agenda today in these 30 minutes. All I want to do is maybe unsettle you a bit, fire flag a feminist curiosity, and visibilized what has been invisibilized, given international politics is marked by state and ideas of power and sovereignty, which remains a very masculinist space. I don't need to take you down that terrain. I think as students in the Department of IR and Geopolitics, we all know about it. And it was very interesting to hear the remarks by Professor just right now in terms of how many feminist thinkers do you study in your classrooms? What does your course curriculum look like? How many feminist authors do you cite? Look at your term papers that you write. How many feminist scholars from Global South, or let's say South Asia, do you read in your classrooms? So I think those are the kind of questions that we need to keep in the backdrop. So as I said, what I want you all to do is wear your feminist filters and think about what Cynthia Enloe calls feminist curiosity. So what does feminist curiosity do to you? I think as students and researchers, what Enloe is pushing us to do is ask the question, where are the women? Ask this question, where are the women in terms of your discipline, in terms of theory, in terms of praxis? And Enloe's question or contention is start looking at the lives of women. From, for instance, textile workers in Bangladesh, to workers who work in sneakers factory in South Korea, to elite diplomats in foreign services of different countries, start looking at how this everyday spaces, how these lived experiences of women provide you insights and give you a different or an alternative picture of the international. So what I want you to do is draw your attention to think about ideas of war and violence, or ideas of war, violence, and security differently. Not start to look at conventional categories what the discipline of IR gives to you. So in some ways, what do I want to foreground in your minds as you try to wear this feminist filters? I want to foreground the idea of everyday. Is the everyday political? Is the everyday political, and is this international? Why so? So do remember when you talk about war, and what do you study in terms of the idea of war? You're talking about state-centric ideas of war. So start to problematizing war as an exceptional event. War is not an exceptional event. It is just one part of war. War is a disruption of the everyday. And why do you need to do that? Because you need to recognize that women's lived experiences in South Asia are different, and there is need to push for making the everyday political and bringing it to the high realm of international politics. So femininity as a concept and women as actors need to be made the objects of analytical curiosity. And do remember, in the context of South Asia, gender is not a homogeneous category. When you're looking at gender and when you're looking at the gender lived experiences in South Asia, this is enmeshed in different hierarchies of identities, such as religion, caste, region. So what you really need is problematize this gender as a homogeneous category. The second important point that I thought I'm going to make today is the politics of location. And I think the epistemic value of the politics of location. Why do we need to talk about the politics of location if you're talking about gender in South Asia, or more specifically, feminist international relations? How would you do feminist international relations differently in South Asia? Is it in dialogue? Is it marked by dissidence? Is it marked by difference? What are the questions that we are asking? I think what I want to underline is that all these 3Ds really characterized feminist IR in South Asia: dialogue, difference, and dissidence. When you're thinking about war, violence, and security, you cannot be thinking about these categories from an ahistorical perspective. And let me start to, flesh it out a bit. When you start to think about war, violence, and security, bring back complex feminist histories that characterize the region. And what are you doing in the process? As students, you're paying attention, or you're highlighting, or you're underlining an alternative genealogy of feminist IR. And I think this is extremely important for us as scholars located in the Global South, because what happens is, as scholars located in the Global South, our politics of location impinges on the politics of knowledge production and epistemic marginalization. So when you're thinking about, for instance, the ideas of complex feminist histories, I would draw your attention to texts, autobiographies, letters, which is conventionally not recognized as international. Do you ever read about these things in your IR courses? I mean, in the opening remarks, we were talking about peace studies and the conversations that we have on peace studies. How many times do we go back to feminist histories and look at ideas of war and violence? Have you heard about this text? Since you also have a focus on philosophy, have you heard about the Buddhist text called Therigatha, which is one of the earliest writings by Buddhist nuns, writing in the 6th century and writing about both war and peace? So what do, for instance, the Therigatha or the Theris provide to you, or provides you in terms of insights in the context of international? So what I'm trying to foreground is think about epistemic value of the politics of knowledge production and the politics of location. And an example that I thought I'll bring to you, something that maybe conventionally people would not talk about, even scholars in South Asia would not talk about it as international, is one of the very interesting, works of a feminist thinker. I would say she's a feminist thinker, Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussain. And she's written a short story called The Sultana's Dream. Now, Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussain's Sultana's Dream, to my mind, is a phenomenal text. Now, it is one of the earliest science fiction stories written by a woman. Bring back Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussain in your alternative genealogy of feminist IR. Now, just very briefly, we need to locate how Ruqayya, through this piece of feminist writing, discursively constructs an alternative imaginary of war and militarism, and through recourse to what can now be classified as an alternative feminist science. Now, it's very important to situate Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussain, to understand the temporality and patterns of her struggle, and also to understand the idea of difference that needs to be foregrounded in the shaping of feminist IR. So there is no singular feminist IR. You need to understand the plurality of the discipline. So Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussain was a Bengali Muslim woman. I want to underline both the identities, who grew up in a colonial province. Think about the politics of post-colonial state, the continuing politics of coloniality, and her different identities signify her politics of resistance. So in what can be classified as a discursive construction of an alternative universe, Ruqayya, through the portrayal of Sultana, offers a scathing but witty critique of both militarism and patriarchy. She talks about, for instance, a feminist science hinged on education. So in your reading on militarism and militarization and your understanding of masculinity, while you're shaping your alternative genealogy of feminist IR, dig deeper into local history. So Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussain's work, or Sultana's Dream, to my mind, is such a minefield of resource. Similarly, and why I'm really talking about this is, as I said right at the beginning, I'm interested in this idea of difference. And I think in the South Asian context, I think Chandra Talpade Mohanty is so right when she talks about that you need to underline the politicization of experience. Professor Hiraganga was talking about voice. I think the idea of voice is so important. But again, the voice cannot be homogenizing. You need to understand the differences in the voice of women. So for instance, if you're looking at war and violence, let's say in Sri Lanka, how is, for instance, the lived experience of a Tamil woman different from the lived experience of a Sinhalese woman? So how is it that the idea of intersecting identities play out in our understanding of the idea of difference? So a related point that I wanted to make on this is, very often students come to me and say, do you think this is really global? Do you think this is really international? Don't you think this is all local? I think ask yourself the question, who frames what is global and what is local? Most of the time, most scholarship that is coming from the global north tends to marginalize women's writings in South Asia as women writing on A, B, C, D, but not on women writing on the international. So having said that, I think another thinker that I'll push you to think about is Savitribai Phule. How many of you read about Savitribai Phule, again, in your understanding on the international relations theory course? I haven't seen courses that would talk about Savitribai Phule, or the politics of resistance, the pedagogy of resistance, which is so important when we are framing academic disciplines like international. And I think go back and read Savitribai Phule as a feminist thinker and scholar in your IR classroom. To my mind, Savitribai Phule's work gives you insights on the idea of violence, not just physical violence, but on the ideas of structural violence, on the ideas of cultural violence, and what has been visibilized and invisibilized. And more importantly, what constitutes the political, and hence what constitutes the international. So I think through a reading of feminist thinkers located in different histories in South Asia, like Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussain and Savitribai Phule, think about an alternative genealogy of the discipline of international relations itself. Now, the minute you start doing that, your feminist filters will walk you through key ideas of IR differently. For instance, the idea of security, the idea of militarism, the idea of militarization. So is it security, security from what? Are you talking about threats only in the context of territorial threats? Not essentially. When you start to think about structural violence, these are not threats that are essentially located only on the borders. So how do you marginalize the state in the framing of the questions of war and violence? So I think what feminist scholars would do is they would draw your attention to how state or national security frameworks not only fail to pay attention to security, especially for marginalized members of the society, but also are themselves significantly implicated in producing insecurities which are deeply gendered and racialized. So, for instance, feminist scholars will draw your attention to the politics of militarism and militarization. And so militarism, not just as an ideology, but also militarization as a socio-political process. Now, what do you discern from this conversation that I'm having? All scattered. How do we weave this together? What is the meaty core for analysis? One, that most militarization occurs in what is labeled as peacetime. What looks like peace, this is peace, but is it really peace? How do you problematize the idea of peace? Have you noticed the camouflage green outfits for young boys that you would most often find in the market? Have you thought about why these camouflage green uniforms are problematic or not problematic? Do you notice how masculinity plays out in the images of the nukes? And why is it that more often than not, you would hear of vulnerability and weakness as a sign of femininity? If India does not test its nuclear capabilities, India should go wear bangles. Where is the idea of bangles coming in? Where is the idea of masculinity really playing out in the images? Look at the images, look at the cartoons that would exemplify nuclear politics. There's very interesting work of Carol Cohn, who talks about how masculinity plays out in security language. So it's very interesting to look at the discursive constellations that actually exemplify the language that is used, for instance, in the national security discourse. Let me give you another example, since we're talking about militarization. I think a linked point would be, look at South Asia. How do you classify contexts as war, post-war, post-conflict? Can I use them interchangeably? Why is it problematic? So for instance, if I'm talking about Sri Lanka, is it post-conflict or still post-war after years of the defeat of LTTE? To my mind, it's still post-war and not post-conflict. And why do I say that? Because of the ever-growing presence of the military security complex. And let's go back to the point that we made on the everyday. Now, if you ever get to travel to Sri Lanka, or maybe just Google, and try looking at the fancy tourist resorts that you have in Sri Lanka. If you look at Sri Lanka, the map of Sri Lanka, in the northern region and the eastern region, which obviously was at the peak of conflict. Now, Google and look at all the tourist resorts that you have. You have really posh tourist resorts, offering you good deals. Sri Lanka is sold as a tourist paradise. Now, bring back the everyday in militarization. Who owns these tourist spaces? Most of these tourist spaces are owned by the military in Sri Lanka. And look at how the military is engaged in the everyday in terms of sports activity, in terms of control of civilian spaces. So how has militarization really pervaded these so-called normalized spaces in post-war Sri Lanka? Let me give you an interesting example in the context of Lagoon Ed's Resort. And do look at the history of Lagoon Ed's Resort. It's fascinating and it's also very disturbing. Now, the Lagoon's Ed's Resort is owned by the Sri Lankan army. Now, it overlooks the body of water around which the tigers made their last stand. It is marketed to Sinhalese war tourists as an opportunity to bask in the afterglow of the battlefield, where the military defeated the tiger terrorists. This clearly shows what I was talking about, how militaristic neoliberalism relies on masculinist fetishism of militarism as a form of power. And if you're interested on this whole idea of militaristic neoliberalism, do look at the work of Merger and Stacheder in that context. Now, the lagoon and the surrounding land, the Lagoon Zed's Resort, was also the site of thousands of fleeing Tamil civilians, rape of Tamil women, many of whom were shot and shelled by the army. But this is erased in the current representation. Thus, the blatant display of majoritarian triumphalism continues to nurture insecurities in the minds of minority Tamil communities. And these insecurities, I emphasize, are both gendered and racialized. So I think what I'm trying to push you to think is, look at the connections between militarism, militarization every day, and the discourse on security. Can you really talk about a security discourse bereft of militarism and militarization? And why do you need to have the everyday as an entry point to this analysis? That's the reason why I thought I'll draw these connections. So I think the other related point that I thought I'll flag, because the canvas is really broad, is that when you're talking about these ideas in South Asia, you cannot but pay attention to the category of post-colonial state. I think it's important to bring in the categories of the post-colonial state, post-colonial anxieties, and continuing ideas of coloniality in terms of your conversation on the international. And what I thought I'll do now is, because you're all young students, maybe looking at research areas, so I thought I'll walk you through some of the images to look at some of the ideas that I was talking about and how this can translate into the question, where are the women? Why do we need to bring back the women in terms of a conversation on international? And how does gender actually make the world go round? So Dhanashree, if I can request you for the first image, just in terms of the complex histories. So if I was to ask you, how do you look at the international if you shift your lens away from the state and start to look at the body as a site for international? Start to look at the whole context of body. Why is the body important as a subject, as an actor, as an agent? And go back into history. So for instance, look at the body and the competing violence in the context of partition. And if I can go to the next image and then come back to this. Dhanashree, this is a film, goes back to my generation. You know that I'm old. This goes back to Pinjar, but I highly recommend that all of you watch it. The whole context of the shifting identities of a woman in the context of partition stories. Dhanashree, if I can go back and look at this narrative which Menon and Kamla Bhasin bring to us. Abducted as Hindus, converted and married a Muslim, recovered as Hindus, but required to relinquish their children because they were born of Muslim fathers, and disowned as impure and ineligible for marriage within their erstwhile family and community. Their identities were in a continuous state of construction and reconstruction. So when you look at international relations, when you look at the ideas of international, how do you bring back a feminist analysis or a gendered analysis of categories which are important in South Asia, like partition? So when we're talking about this, why does the woman's body as a site, as an actor, becomes important for us? And what insights does it give to you? Look at the intersecting identities that are playing out in this narrative. If I can go further, so if you're talking about partition, I think we also need to talk about the partition on the other side of the border. Can we go forward, Dhanashree? The next one. How many of you know about the Biranganas, and the liberation war of Bangladesh? If I have to talk about the Biranganas, the whole context of the category of war heroes or war heroines, if I can use the word. Again, allegedly women from Bangladesh who were allegedly raped by the Pakistan army. And the politics around body, the politics of protection, the politics of masculinist control, the politics around progeny, the politics around continuing violence in terms of the different categories that we're talking about. I think I mentioned about how do you need to think about what has been visibilized and what has been invisibilized. So in the context of liberation wars, you tend to look at the liberation wars through the prism of nationalism, through all the isms that you're talking about. But when you do a gendered analysis, how is gender really subsumed in the category of nationalism? What are the problem areas? How do you start problematizing in these conceptions? If I can go on to the next one. So I think what you need to understand, and what I'd urge you to look at is, look at the idea of nationalism and understand that it's highly gendered. Basically, the nation is depicted as the motherland. So within this image of the nation as the mother, the woman serves, or the woman's body serves, as a repository of group identities. So women's bodies are the boundary markers of the nation and the bearer of its future. The woman's body is the community, the nation's most valuable possession, and needs to be protected or controlled. It'll completely take you on a different swing in terms of level of analysis that international relations scholars do. So from the body to the community, to the nation, to the region, to the international, and look at the multifaceted intersecting oppressions and constellations of oppressions that take place in this analysis. If I can go forward. So again, when you're looking at body politics, you need to bring back categories of shame, humiliation, and the politics of motherhood. So I think when you're talking about the international, you need to bring back, for instance, the discourse on sexual violence, which was conventionally relegated to the private sphere, not recognized as something within the public domain, with which IR scholars have conventionally been interested in. But sexual violence in armed conflict is that violence against women which is directed towards the social group of which she's a member. Because to rape a woman is to humiliate her community. So you don't just rape a woman, you either rape a Hindu woman or a Muslim woman or a Sinhalese woman or a Tamil woman. So there is this identity because, she exemplifies the honor of that community, of that nation. And the minute you transgress the body, you bring shame, you bring dishonor. And that is why the politics of boundary markers becomes important. So complex and combined emotions of hatred, superiority, vengeance for real or imagined wrongs, and national pride are engendered and deliberately manipulated in armed conflict. Would you conventionally look at this when you study war and violence? So, that's where the swing is really moving. We can go on to the next one. Again, this is a narrative from Sri Lanka. Just look at the different categories. Why I thought I'll put this narrative out there, because right at the outset, I was talking about problematize gender as a homogeneous category. Look at the intersecting identities. So look at the categories that come in here. Manchanayaka Srilata, a widow, a single mother, and a sex worker. Now, these are three complex identities that you need to understand. So for instance, when you're looking at women as actors, you need to understand the difference in all these categories, the difference in terms of lived experiences. So for instance, in the case of Sri Lanka, the experiences of Muslim women in the east of Sri Lanka are very different from the experiences of Hindu women in the north of Sri Lanka, but both of them are Tamil. So, there's a common identity there. Similarly, if you're looking at the experiences of female-headed households, that would be very different from the category of a single mother or a widow. Because do remember, there is this intersecting cultural practices that come into play. So for instance, would you talk about things like land rights and ownership when you're talking about these different categories? Again, think about, the women who were part of the LTTE and the politics of reintegration. So what I'm trying to say is, not just look at intersecting identities with gender, but also looked at lived experiences located in the location, the politics of location, and women as actors given these differences in terms of identities, both social, political, and cultural. If we can simplify and say that, we can move on to the next one. So I think this is something that I've already talked about, that, militarism, militarization, and all the isms that we are talking about intersect with patriarchy and masculinity. And women are actually doubly prone in both as members of a community and nation and victims within the community and nation. That's something that you really need to understand. The double-edged victimization that happens. We can move on to the next one. Since I was talking about actors, I thought I would put this out. I talked about the category of female-headed households, or the whole context of, widows or single mothers. Now, this is a very interesting, I would say, this is an interesting category for us to think about. This is an image from the Dardpura village in Kashmir. Now, Dardpura has a very, I would say, painful history. In this village, there are no men, no husbands, no sons. Most men either picked up by the security forces or have crossed the border in terms of joining the militant movement. And the women in this village were classified as half widows because they don't have the death certificates, they don't know whether their husbands are alive. And this category of half widows is not legally and institutionally recognized. So at the beginning, when I was talking about look at feminist curiosity and look at feminist filters and look at women as analytical categories, you need to foreground these differing lived experiences in different geographical spaces in South Asia. So how do you, for instance, talk about a half widow in your analysis of the Kashmir conflict or the politics of militarization and the politics of feminist IR in South Asia? And why does this idea of difference again plays out through these different spaces? We can move ahead, Dhanashree. Again, the politics of camp spaces and gender. So, you would look at it. There's in fact a very interesting study by Gray and Frank, which talks about refugees as risk and refugees at risk. So when you're talking about refugees at risk, feminized vulnerability, but very racialized. So if you talk about, for instance, the Rohingya refugees, Rohingya women are like at risk, but Rohingya men are looked at as risk. So look at that distinction in terms of enemies at the gate, at risk and as risk. So the politics of these gendered spaces. We can move ahead. Again, a very powerful image to my mind. This was before the Taliban took over, but just look at this image. And this is about peace process. Do remember, Afghanistan, in terms of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, has a national action plan. Women had a place on the peace table with the Afghan Peace and Reintegration Program. But this is it. When you're talking about formal peace negotiations, sorry, that's nothing to do with women. Don't spot them anywhere. Look at the image very carefully. If you can spot a woman in this space. So I think some very interesting insights that I got when I was in Kabul and I was working on the Women, Peace and Security agenda and formal peace processes were that there were women on the peace table along with ulemas and the warlords. But when you would talk to, for instance, an ulema, they would say, yes, they're allowed to go to the provincial peace committees or to the provinces, but there's a big but. The but is they need to have a male accompaniment. They can't go without a male accompaniment. So think about the politics of gender and peace process. Think about why is it that when you have normative frameworks like Women, Peace and Security agenda, still those normative frameworks are not transformative in South Asia. So something that you might be interested in is the politics of WPS agenda. So the United Nations passed a Security Council resolution in the year 2000, Resolution 1325. And interestingly, only 3 countries in South Asia have a NAP, National Action Plan: Afghanistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh. And technically, India says it has no conflicts, no armed conflicts. So the question of gender and armed conflicts and impacts, and there is a different kind of definition of intrastate armed conflicts. So that's just for you to again wear your feminist filter and think about and problematize this category. We can go ahead. This is something that I want to talk about, problematize this benevolent, liberal, feminist order that comes from the global north. I am tired of that kind of a narrative. I have to say that. And I think it's fascinating to look at Dhanashree's work in that context, bring back the intersectional lens into your analysis. The liberal order also has imperial logics. Take it with a pinch of salt. This is not to say that go back to the politics of regression, but start to think about alternative ways of looking at gender. So for instance, how is it that you should be looking at, and I would say that religion is not an untouchable category in that context, something that you need to engage with if you're in South Asia. I mean, if you look at Ashish Nandi's work, he would say, how can you not talk about religion, or how can you not talk about ethnicity, or how can you not talk about your geographical location? I mean, so go back to, the whole context of the politics of South Asia and bring back the intersectional lens in analysis. Take the liberal order with a pinch of salt. Look at the politics of empire and imperial logics in the framing of the international. We could move forward. Something that I wanted to say upfront is that women are not always victims of war and violence. Women are also perpetrators of war and violence. And you need to look at the politics of agency within the context of armed conflict, be it Nepal, be it Sri Lanka. So I think this narrative of victimhood needs to be problematized in that sense. We could go forward. This is something that I put on purpose. This is an old image, but I really like this image. I took it off Twitter. And please look at this image very carefully and look at what is happening in Ukraine right now. Everyone knows that Merkel was scared of dogs, and Putin in an official meeting got this dog. Look at the smirk on Putin's face. You know, I think you need to do what should I say, discourse analysis, not just in the context of text, but also in terms of the language, the silences, you know, and look at the smirk, the play of masculinity, the play of power between two heads of states. And I think what I was trying to do, and I was trying to look at more images, but somehow I couldn't download the free versions. Look at many of the images that are coming from Russia and Ukraine right now in terms of coercive power, the whole politics of nuclear button that's playing out, and think about questions of masculinity and femininity, how they are playing out. So I think what I want to now just close, Dhanashree, are we doing okay in terms of time? I'll just take a couple of minutes and close.
That's fine. You can complete it. Yeah, we have time. Yeah.
So we can just go on to the next slide. So I think when you're thinking about war, violence, peace, and security in South Asia, look at it as a continuum of direct cultural and structural violence, something which is visible and something which is not visible too. We move on to the next one. So, and what does engendering IR mean? Or what would it mean to think about IR differently with the lens of gender in terms of view? Focus empirical feminism, focus on women and explore gender dynamics as an empirical dimension of IR. Analytical feminism, use gender as a theoretical category to reveal the gender bias of international relations concept. Normative feminism that reflects on the process of theorizing in the role of scholarship in the normative agenda for global social and political change. The last slide, Dhanashree, please. And in the process, think about the politics of knowledge production, the politics of I would say the constraints of conceptual interventions that come from the global north, and recognize that the everyday is political as well as international. Pay attention to an alternative genealogy of IR, and remember that there's no singular IR that is mandated and legitimized by the global north. So something that you should start doing is, when you look at your course syllabi, look at how many women are there in terms of your readings. When you write your term paper, look at how many women are you citing. Are you citing, and if you're citing women, look at which women are you citing, you know, and why are you citing that? So visualize the work of feminist scholars from South Asia. And I think I'll stop here now for now. Thank you, Dhanashree. I'm sorry if I just took more time.
No, not at all. Thank you so much, Shweta. That was a great lecture, and I'm glad you brought up so many different layers of scholarship and analysis that students can reflect upon or can explore further if they are interested. So that I think the lecture pretty much laid down all the different layers of scholarship and research in the field of gender and feminist perspectives in international relations. So I'm really glad you were able to bring it up. I will now open the floor for questions. So those who have questions, please raise your hands. And also, like the other options, you can also type out your questions if you're unable to unmute yourself or something. So let me start by inviting Preeti to ask a question. Preeti.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, so I'm actually a fourth-year law student at the School of Law, Christ Deemed to be University, Bangalore. And I have been very interested in international law and public international law for like almost a year now. Since I'm close to graduating, I'm looking at arenas for research. So just a small thing, the question to Shweta ma'am is about half widows that ma'am mentioned in her talk about how there's no legal recognition whatsoever for those kind of people, however they still exist. So to what extent is the international community, or why is the international law still silent on this? Because we have many conventions as to limiting war crimes on women and sort of bringing that down and reducing or whatsoever. So why is, I mean, isn't there a solution, or why is it still silent? Because when we know that something like this exists, there has to be a solution to the problem. We can't just stay mum on that. So yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
I think, Shweta, we can take one, like, if that's okay with you, one question at a time, so you can answer it and then we can move on to the next question. Yeah.
I'm fine with it. Just in case, in the interest of time, if you want to club questions, I'm okay with that also. But just quickly to respond to Preeti, I think that's an important question that you're asking. And honestly speaking, I have no answer to it, because all said and done, Preeti, there are normative frameworks. We know that, there is CEDAW and India is a signatory to CEDAW. We know there is United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, but these are all norms. Now, you need to talk about who are the norm entrepreneurs, how does it diffuse in the context of, the local, and why is it that these norms are still not translated in terms of domestic legislations? And I think that's a challenge. So for instance, in the context of half widows, if you're talking about, we would need to talk about questions around marriage laws. We would need to talk about questions around land ownership rights. And these are all gray areas, because the minute you start to recognize that, do remember you're also recognizing a gray category in terms of militarized spaces. So how do you actually deal with that? So I don't think I've actually answered your question, but all I'm saying is that there are these normative frameworks. We do have these norms, but are these norms translating on ground? Are these norms transformative enough? I think as a law student, you very well know that the whole idea is not to have laws. I think we all have laws, but the implementation part of it is with a big question mark. And the bigger question mark is the transformative part of it. So I think, yeah.
Thank you so much. Next question by Trisha Ghosh. Yeah, Trisha, go ahead.
Yeah, hi ma'am, my name is Shweta Ghosh. I'm a final year student from Geopolitics. First of all, thank you so much for giving the importance to Rokeya Sakhawat Hussain. I'm flattered to be a part of her school. Yeah, so I have two questions. First, it's related to my dissertation topic. So I'm working on gender-based violence in Rohingya refugee camp. So do you think any institution can intervene the particular matter or the event, or is systemic change from societal level needed in this particular event? And my second question is, what do you think, like, I just want to know your take on this matter. South Korea, why they did not feel the need of abortion bill to, make the thing? Is it a religious perspective, or the way they treat women in the service sector that will be a huge change for them, for the whole system and the leaders and also the service sector? Yeah, thank you.
Great question again. On the Rohingya refugees at the institutional level, something that I want to draw your attention, since you're working on this and you're interested in this area of research, is look at the politics of securitization around the Rohingya refugees in South Asia. You need to look at how the refugees are being framed not at risk, but as risk. And there is this politics of existential threat that is being normalized and internalized in the national security discourse. So I think if you're talking about that, the related point is you need to look at the politics of humanitarian intervention. So what would be privileged? If humanitarian intervention or humanitarian politics hinging on ideas of cosmopolitanism, or a heightened sense of fear that comes from a national security discourse which securitizes the Rohingya refugees. So I think my answer to you would be, look at these different dimensions. And if you're looking at institutional responses, it's important to understand at what level are you looking at institutional responses. Are you looking at it at the regional level? Are you looking at it at the national level? Or are you looking at it at the international level? And are these different levels really are in sync with each other? Because if you're looking at UNHCR and the challenges, for instance, that UNHCR would face in the context of India, that would be very different from the politics of UNHCR and the national level challenges that it would face in Bangladesh. So I think you need to understand these nuances in the context of Rohingya refugees. I have to say, I haven't followed the politics in the context of South Korea, in the context of the abortion bill. So I'll let it go. But I would say, look at, and that's a related point that I'm making, because this controversy stemmed up in the context of Northern Ireland also. Look at the politics of control of progeny and the politics of motherhood in the context of women's bodies. And I think the whole debate around abortion politics should be taken back to that level of analysis.
Yeah, thank you. Innocentia, go ahead.
Yes. Good evening, ma'am. Thank you for the lecture. This is Innocentia here, and I'm also a final year student at the department. And my dissertation topic is towards a feminist foreign policy in South Asia. So my question to you is a feminist foreign policy within the South Asian region a possibility? And if it is, how would it help the region?
That's a very good question. I have to say that on feminist foreign policy, I mean, normatively, I would say yes. Why is it not possible? Look at, I mean, all said and done, look at what Sweden is doing. But are we willing to adapt and adopt a feminist foreign policy? And I think if you are looking at the value that feminist foreign policy would bring to South Asia, I think what it would bring would be the norms of cooperation would get privileged over the norms of conflict in that context. Look at how it would impact, for instance, the framing of security. How would a feminist foreign policy look at ideas of security? How would it reframe, for instance, the idea of national security? So I would say yes, a feminist foreign policy is something we definitely need in South Asia. But is that something that we can get going with? That's a big question mark in the South Asian region. Go back to the politics of South Asia and start to think about it. I think we need to push for it. And I think more and more young people like you should do research on the ideas of feminist foreign policy and the value that it would bring to the region. I think all of us understand that South Asia as a region still stands so not integrated. And why is it that it still stands so not integrated? Because we are still so tied to the idea of what should I say, to complex trust deficits, security dilemma, and still playing out on it. So feminist foreign policy would undo many of these ideas that are tied to conventional templates in IR.
Yeah. So I mean,
thank you, ma'am.
It's a difficult question to answer as well, because a feminist foreign policy is still at a nascent stage, even in the global north, and how the way things are going over there in Europe. I don't see any feminist interventions, even when it comes to the Ukrainian, the war that is going on right now. So there's a long way to go in South Asia. Yes, Teresa, go ahead with your question.
Hello, ma'am. Thank you for that lecture. So I also work in gender and conflict, and one of the most common questions that my professors have put forth is the lack of data about a lot of things, including how gendered implications of conflict function. So how do you think is the way to go about this? Because the cases that have the most data are the most researched about, because again, you can substantiate your claim, but cases that are a little more under-researched remain under-researched. So is there any way to go about this?
Good question, Teresa. And also, I mean, when you're talking about data, I mean, there's also the politics of data. I still remember, when I was doing fieldwork for my monograph in Kashmir, one of the most powerful narratives that has stayed with me was all of you scholars come from Delhi or from other parts of the world, interview us, use this as a data, and our stories are just transformed as data, and you publish it. and we leave it at that. So there is also the ethical dilemma of data, something which I always flag as researchers, the ethics of data collection. That's one, how do you really, have your conversation with a respondent? Is the respondent just a subject for you? An informant, just from whom you're, if I can say, extracting data. And to my mind, that's very problematic. So something that I always say is the feminist ethics of data collection. That's something which is extremely important. The second related point which you talked about is how it stands very under-researched and the lack of data. I would say, if it is feasible, I'd encourage you to do field work. It's extremely important to be connected to the voice on ground. Something that you should always look at, if it is possible. And I understand there are institutional constraints, there are different kinds of constraints, but if it's possible, do field work. And I think with the digital age, it's also possible to do interviews online. I think something that's really like come up in the age of pandemic is, how do you do digital field work? It's much less, there's a lack of connection there, but look at alternative ways of doing field work. And if you can travel to the field, definitely yes. The other thing that I always say is, look at triangulation. Don't just do field work, but also look at, different kinds of publications and primary resources from the region. And I think something which is very important, and if you can lay your hands on, is that if you're looking at conflict zones, a number of very rich resources you will get most of the time, not essentially in the English language. So something that I can really say is, so do you have access to translations? Would you have access in terms of a translator? Travel to the field, field gives you a completely different insight. I don't think I would go by that. A number of scholars might not agree with me, but I am someone who would say, go to the field. Till the time you go to the field, you don't really get that rich insight. And remember, the field is also very complex. So for instance, I can talk about my own field experience in Kabul. When I was in Kabul in the year 2017, and I was working on my paper on the United Nations Security Council 1325, and I wanted to look at Afghanistan's response, it was very interesting that I realized while I was using snowball sampling and I was interviewing different women, most women that I had interviewed were either Pashtun or Tajik. So something that I realized was, I need to find the voice of the Hazara women. And most women that I were interviewing were from urban spaces, people who were in Kabul. But having said that, you also need to recognize the limitations of your own identity in a context like Afghanistan. So for instance, I was an Indian research scholar. I had security constraints. I couldn't move beyond Kabul. I couldn't travel to rural provinces. So it's very good to be ambitious, and at your age, it's also very exciting. But you also need to, I need to be practical in terms of your approach. So working in conflict zones is very different from working in any other zone. The other related thing that I want to flag is, when you're doing field research, something that a number of us working on conflict zones go through is what I call secondary trauma. Your respondents and their life histories and their trauma start to impact you. And again, the ethical dilemma of how do you address that secondary trauma. These are questions that you need to ask when you're trying to design your field work. And also, please always, going by the ethics of the research, and I'm sure your university does it, look at the politics of consent. Don't publish or cite a narrative for which you don't have consent, because these are very personal stories that come to you. If there are stories of sexual violence and of rape, they take the respondent back on a different journey. So, the ethics of consent is something which is extremely important. And I think I don't have to say that this whole thing about photographing and recording, and I think you need to understand the politics of all that in your fieldwork. So just that.
Yeah. Okay. Can we take 2 more questions, Shweta, if that's okay with you? Okay. Yeah. Trifine, go ahead with your question.
Good evening, ma'am. I'm Trifin. I'm from Gandhian Center. I'm studying my final year in the course called Art and Peace Studies. So I actually had 2 questions. One was, when you spoke about like different engendering IR, basically, when you spoke about different feminist perspectives, I wanted to like know if you could cite any certain like empirical studies which discuss the effects of war on women. That's one. And the other one is what kind of images and popular culture that depict negotiation and conflict also taken through the feminine lens? Like, are they taken through the feminine lens in the first place? Because most of these images that you see are very masculine inherently, you know. Or does one have to see them only through the feminine, like the female gaze, and analyze them, as I said, because most are masculine in a way. So yeah, just these are the two questions I had.
Very good questions. And if you're looking at, women, war and violence, I would direct you to works like Swati Barashar, Bina De Coste, Meghna Guhotakarte, Amina Mohsin, Anuradha Chinoy. There are a range of feminist IR scholars, that you could look at. Rita Manchanda, you could look at Poonam Yadav. And these are all scholars that I want to cite from the Global South, but I would highly recommend that you look at Christine Sylvester's work on the context of body politic and war. This would be some, most IR courses would have Antichner, but do look at Christine Sylvester's work. That's something which would be very useful. Your second question, I'm not sure if I understood you correctly. If you're talking about the gaze, I think the gaze is very important. And I think when you're looking at, and I think that's the idea that I wanted to foreground through the feminist curiosity that I was talking about. How do you actually read or reread an image? An image is not just by itself. An image is situated in a context. And there is a lot of work, for instance, I don't know if you're familiar with Lene Hansen's work, but Lene Hansen's work in the context of the Danish cartoons was very interesting. And so Lene Hansen is, for instance, talking about gender and securitization. And so a text, for instance, or a visual image, is not by itself. You need to situate it in a context, and that would be very, very, very fascinating. And please do remember, if you're looking at the discipline of IR, you were you said that you have different kinds of centers, but visual politics and the visual turn in IR is emerging in a big way. Look at Emma Hutchinson's work or Roland Bleicher's work in the context of visual politics and IR. For instance, I would say, since you were talking about popular culture, I would say pick up the different Netflix series on criminal profiling and look at the politics of Islamophobia, the politics around gender, the politics around racialized violence, and do that as an analysis, or look at something like Game of Thrones and look at the ideas that you can talk about in the context of just the ideas of power or any of the categories. One of the things that I really enjoy doing with my students, and I'm going to maybe talk about that, is look at international, like locate the international, not in any of the conventional texts. So pick up either a work of fiction or music or art and start to think about the international. So for instance, what would Madhubani art give you insights in the context of international? Or what would murals talk to you about the international? You can talk about the politics of reconciliation and peace and the politics of murals in the context of Northern Ireland. There's a lot of work on that. There's a lot of work, for instance, on the politics of resistance and art in militarized zones. You can talk about it in the context of Kashmir. There's also poetry. I don't know if you know about this genre of poetry called Lande, resistance poetry by Afghan women, and in the context of when they were underground and they were not allowed to study or to read. So all what I'm saying is look at alternative sites, and in that context, the gaze is definitely important. And I don't know if I got your question right, but yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. You've done very good justice to the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, there's one last question. This is actually from the comments. This is by Avisha. Her question is, when talking about the Biranganas in Bangladesh, it started as a benign policy to honor women who were raped in the liberation war, but it soon turned into a derogatory and oppressive term to denigrate women. What can be done when the discourse changes so drastically, and why does the discourse change?
Good question, and I think that's where I'm saying it's always the woman's body, which is the site of different kinds of competing violence and discourse, And do remember, this is a lot to do with the politics of shame, honor, the isms that we are talking about, the nationalisms that we're talking about. So for instance, how would a Virangana be framed in a populist discourse? What would be different about it? How would Virangana be framed in the context of a discourse which focuses on different kinds of fundamentalisms? Again, go back to the question of body, and I think the body politics and the politics of sexual violence cannot be bereft of this politics of shame, humiliation, boundary markers, and the isms that we are talking about. So all these policies need to be read in that light.
Okay, I think that's all. I don't see any other hands raised. But if it's okay with you, Shweta, I would like to share your email with at least some of the scholars who want to work further, look at some of these issues. I mean, most of them actually asked questions anyway, but they would like to keep in touch further. Yeah, so it would be wonderful that you can further engage with our department and also with the Gandhian Center as well. So it was a great pleasure to host you today. And as a part of this UNESCO Peace Chair activity in particular, this is something that, on gender in particular, we are conducting an event for the first time. So, we are trying to bring in these perspectives more and more often. So I would like to now again invite Teresa to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. As we come to the end of this insightful lecture, on behalf of the Department of IR and Geopolitics, I, Teresa Shaju, would like to thank Dr. Shweta for sparing the time to engage with all the students and inspire many of us to continue our research in this field. And I think a lot of us will start our research in this field after listening to you. I'd also like to thank the organizers, Dr. Dhanashree and Dr. Vardesh, for organizing this lecture, and finally, the audience for their presence and active participation that made it a successful lecture. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Teresa. And I once again want to actually thank the department for this wonderful conversation. I was really not sure of the canvas on which I can pitch it. So maybe, these were different kinds of scattered ideas, but I'm glad that, and I'll be very glad that we continue this conversation. So thank you once again, Dhanashree and Professor Varangi, for this opportunity. And it's wonderful interacting with all of you.